Hello, and welcome to tonight's episode of Youth Truth. I'm your host, Thomas Throssell. Tonight, joining us live from Sydney is best-selling author of book Un-Australian Identity, David Trewin. And joining us live from the States is journalist John Davenport. How are we, gentlemen? How's it going?
Thanks, Thomas. Happy to join you.
Tonight on YT, we'll be jumping into a pressing and perhaps messy issue, multiculturalism in Australia. Does it exist? What does it look like? And has it been successful? Now, David, obviously this is what your book is about, so would you like to share a little bit about it? Sure, it's titled Un-Australian Identity, hopefully to catch some eyes, and it's basically about the treatment of other cultures in Australia in the past, but more specifically now. I think it's an interesting question, has multiculturalism been successful? Because how can you really measure that? And I've sort of covered this in my book, looking at both the Indigenous struggle and that of the immigrants, specifically from Asia and the Middle East. In terms of legal barriers, where we have things like the 1975 Racial Discrimination Act, there's no more immigration policy, nothing physically barring a race. Multiculturalism has been successful in those areas, and although that applies to all Western nations really. However, I think it's something we can never measure is the social attitude behind it all, and I think that is far more important. I believe that the hostility towards the Indigenous is largely over, but the focus is now on the Muslim population and their culture, but in time this will change. So for that reason, I don't think it's been successful yet, but I believe it can and it will be. A very valid point. Thanks, David. John, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, why not? Now, I agree with David in the fact that under legislation, multiculturalism is always successful. Obviously, there's never going to be legislation denoting a race, denying rights. It's always going to promote people. And I think that when there's no legal barrier anymore, it allows the social attitudes to progress along equally fast. Obviously, as an American, I have little first-hand experience of any underbelly of culture there may be in Australia. But I've been to the major cities on a number of occasions, and I feel like I've experienced what it's like to live in Australia and enough to know what I'm talking about. I've also studied Australian history in depth, and I find it fascinating, specifically the fact that Australia is a nation that's 125 years younger than my own. Yet it went through some of the same cultural changes we did at almost exactly the same time. For example, in the mid-1960s, when the civil rights movement was really gaining momentum in the U.S. A couple of years later, in 1967, the referendum was passed in Australia. And it's towards the Indigenous people solving the same problem we were facing at almost exactly the same time. And that's fascinating because Australia is over a century younger than us, yet it's going through the same changes we are at the same date. And that's impressive. I think also with the Vietnam War, when Australia went in alongside us, they were sort of forced to come of age because they experienced everything we did, even though they were so much younger than us as a nation. And I think that the speed at which these changes have been happening are kind of an indication that unquestionably the strive for multiculturalism in Australia has been successful, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. And while I agree with both of you, yes, we have come a long way in terms of multiculturalism. I think that when you boil it down to a couple of individual scales, there can be quite a darker side. So now we're going to take a look at a couple of ads from the Meat and Livestock Association in Australia. Obviously Sam Kekovich and his annual lamb ads. Now they come around every Australia Day, and they've changed quite a bit over the past few years, so we'll just take a look at them now.
Let's get this Barbie started.
This is how we roll.
I'm a Barbie girl in a Barbie world. Excuse plastic, it's fantastic with some chops in there. I'm Barbie everywhere, across the nation. Lamb is my creation.
Come on, Barbie, let's go, Barbie.
I'm a Barbie girl, give the tongues a twirl. Lamb in plastic, it's fantastic. Chops in Tupperware, impresses everywhere. Marination leads to salivation.
So that was the 2012 clip, and it's a bit strange, but now I'll have a look at 5 years later. This is the 2017 one.
Hey, what do you reckon?
Cracking spot. Fire up the Barbie.
Anyone else coming?
Oh, beautiful spot like this, it'll be packed before you know it.
Look, it's the boat people.
Hang on. Aren't we all boat people?
And you're welcome.
What is love? Look, it's the float people.
Hello, Taylor.
Hi, guys.
Thanks for having us, guys. Great spot for a barbie.
best in the world.
So I mean, clearly a lot of changes there. So thoughts? I think it's hilarious, absolutely hilarious, just how much these ads differ. It's crazy how blatant and how straightforward the messages and representations are. You go from the white man's utopia, the high society, rich privileged males, revealingly dressed women, the celebration of wealth is just everywhere. And then suddenly it's a bit of an airy-fairy, all-inclusive ad with everyone from all walks of life. They're trying to display diversity through humour, and it's extremely clear what the stance is on immigration, the Indigenous and other groups who tend to be marginalised. It's very supportive of everyone, doesn't leave anyone out, and I think this is an attempt to connect with a much wider audience and gain more support, obviously.
Yeah, I think the second ad actually does pretty well at using the laughs and the comedy to provoke quite a positive response from their audience, but of course it sparked a little bit of a controversy with some of the jokes used. For example, people still complained it was way too far from accuracy. I mean, there's the genocide, the segregation suffered by these indigenous groups in history that it wasn't even hinted at. It's all positive. I mean, the leading members, indigenous members who were depicted very nicely, but maybe it's a bit too positive for some communities. Now, it is the first ad they've put out without an all-white leading cast, so that's good, but in 2017, maybe not so notable. Personally, I also find things like "it's the float people," referring to the LGBT community, to be a bit excessive because they don't really have anything to do with the focus of the ad. It's outside the typical parameters of promoting multiculturalism in race.
I think a key aspect of this year's ad is how they omitted the purpose of the ad, Australia Day. Year after year, people look forward to this ad, the next edition of the Australia Day Lamb ads. So when they didn't mention Australia Day once, it sparked a bit of a fire.
Hey guys, what's the occasion?
Do we need one?
You know, people fight up over this, and I think that's another huge issue that Australians face every year. The change the date movement's been picking up a lot of momentum over the last few years, especially the last decade. And I think that's a very important part of the journey towards multiculturalism in Australia. The 2017 ad leads out the mention of Australia Day as a bit of a protest, I guess, towards it. And that's quite interesting because I think the easiest way to get an audience's support is to relate to them. And Australia Day being maybe one of the biggest celebrated holidays in Australia, it's a holiday for a large number of people, although not everyone. So I think if you leave out Australia Day, if you leave out the mention of that holiday, then you're losing a lot of support. You're not making that connection with your viewers, which is very important.
What this ad doesn't capture, though, is probably the real attitude of the indigenous towards colonization. I mean, I think it's a bit fantastical to have these leading indigenous characters welcoming everyone into the land, being very open, when in reality, I'd imagine they weren't too happy to be colonized back then. There's always been resentment to what many call Invasion Day instead of Australia Day, and the suffering that ensued after that day. So you can see why when on the surface this ad, it was a harmless attempt at trying to be diverse and promote multiculturalism. It offended a lot of people, especially indigenous communities, because they still felt strongly about the events that took place in history.
Now I'd just like to take a look at a novel, Jasper Jones, before the break. Now this is a 2009 novel from Australian author Craig Silvey, and it's been coined the Australian To Kill a Mockingbird. And I think with good reason too. It may not be on TKM's literary standards, but it certainly parallels a lot of the storyline and a lot of the messages in the novel. Jasper Jones is set in the 1960s in Western Australia in a mining town. It's got a lot of the same Southern Gothic tropes as Harper Lee's novel, especially about the small town mentality and hostility towards marginalised groups. Particularly important is the character of Jasper Jones himself, who's one of the protagonists, and he's the scapegoat for almost everything in the town. And the treatment of Jasper Jones in this novel is probably one of the most realistic fictional stories about life in the early 20th century for Indigenous people in Western Australia, and pretty much all of Australia, I suppose. So I'll read a little bit about the character. Jasper Jones has a terrible reputation in Corrigan. He's a thief, a liar, a thug, a truant. He's lazy and unreliable. He's a feral and an orphan, or as good as. His mother is dead. His father is no good. He's the rotten model of what parents hold aloft as a warning. This is how you'll end up if you're disobedient. Jasper Jones is the example of where poor aptitude and attitude will lead. So obviously it's quite a negative depiction of Jasper.
I mean, that there's almost a perfect description of just how these indigenous people, whether mixed race or not, were treated back in the 60s and prior to that. It's really quite horrible. What's very interesting, though, is the language used here. These words describe him all sort of pack a punch. They're very descriptive and paint this ultimate negative portrait in the reader's mind of what this kid looks like. He's everything you're not supposed to be. He's the polar opposite of what you would hold aloft. He's the worst thing you can imagine. And I mean, he's given the worst image out of everyone in the town, purely for the reason that he's different. He's one of a kind. And that really outlines like where the racism is coming from. It's maybe not so much specifically the race, but the fact that he's one of a kind, and therefore he's different from everyone. Therefore we need to marginalize him for his differences.
As sad as that is to read, and it's probably a very realistic account of how many Indigenous people were perceived back then. What I think is important about this is highlighting just how far our own society has progressed from such negative views. That sort of thing, labelling someone like that, especially on the basis of race, is completely unheard of. It just wouldn't happen and doesn't happen anymore. Jasper Johns and his image are quite useful in demonstrating the progression of the attitudes and the successes of multiculturalism. You have the extreme polar from Jasper Johns in the 1960s to now. They're nothing alike. Thanks, Dave and John. I'd just like to sum up a bit. I think Australia's moved a long way since colonisation, federation, the 1967 referendum, but it certainly has a long way to go. Yes, all barriers have been removed and there is no trace of segregation. We're all equal in the law. But in the mindset of many Australians, we may not be all the way there. I think that once we let go of any hostility, and the Indigenous communities we live alongside also let go of any resentment about events of the past, we can finally move to calling Australia a truly multicultural place. Alright, we're going to have to cut to a break, but when we come back, we'll be looking at the Asian and Middle Eastern side of the story, and a little bit about David's book. Thank you.